All right. Hi, everybody. This is Scott Lopano with the Corporate Incubation Special Session. Thanks, everybody, for joining. We've got an awesome group of panelists to speak today, and we're really here to gather this group of corporate and entrepreneurial audience for a conversation to share some actionable insights, lessons learned between the large companies that are running some of the best accelerators in the country, as well as the startups that have gone through those accelerators and incubators, and the lessons learned from both sides of the table, ultimately with sharing some best practices for creating value, shared value across both organizations. Some housekeeping items. We will take questions at the end of the session. So please continue to submit them throughout. They will be posted to me, so I'll try to keep my eye out on questions coming real time, and I'll try to address a few of those as they come up. Otherwise, there'll be some Q&A at the end. And following the panel introductions, you're going to hear from two business development and innovation leaders, one at Wells Fargo's Innovation Incubator, the other at AT&T's Aspire Accelerator. And following that, we'll talk to two founders that have actually successfully gone through those programs and have made great progress. And before the Q&A, like I said, we'll bring all of them together to talk through, as a group discussion, some of the keys to building a successful corporate startup relationship. So first, I suppose we should do introductions. So I'll start just briefly with myself. I'm Scott Lopano, the principal at TechScore Ventures and Engage. We are an early stage venture firm based in Atlanta, and we run an early stage venture fund that's focused on companies at the seed and Series A stage based in the Southeast, many of whom are selling to enterprise B2B, or marketplace companies. We also founded and run the Engage corporate innovation platform, which is really a collaboration of some of the major Fortune 1000s based in Atlanta and the Southeast. So you could think of Delta or Cox, UPS, et cetera, all from different industries who have come together to invest in a fund and be partners in a corporate innovation platform. Their goal really to learn from each other on how best practices for innovation, as well as really learn how to work best with startups in that anywhere from seed to Series B stage. So really thinking through early stage innovation across the country. And so excited to be here today to speak to the experts and really tease out some of the nuances that I've had the ability to see in terms of how to find best practices for startups working together with corporates. So let me just turn to introductions really quickly, and I'll bring on first and foremost Ramsey Huntley, Sustainable Finance Strategist with Wells Fargo. As a member of the Sustainability and Corporate Responsibility Leadership Team, Ramsey oversees the development and execution of Wells Fargo's sustainable finance strategy. I'll let him speak more to that role, but he has a fantastic background, having the responsibility for the bank's clean tech philanthropy programs, as well as the award-winning Wells Fargo Innovation Incubator, IN2, in conjunction with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So he has a long career in sustainability and a passion for environmental policy. I'll let him speak here to a bit more about what he does today with Wells Fargo.
Great, thank you, Scott, and thank you to the U.S. Chamber for having me this morning. Appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit more about what we're up to here at Wells Fargo. As Scott said, my name is Ramsey Huntley, and I'm the Sustainable Finance Strategist here at Wells Fargo. So I work across the enterprise to develop and grow our sustainable finance opportunities, particularly those related to clean technology. And as part of that role, I'm honored to lead the Wells Fargo Innovation Incubator, or as Scott said, IN2, which is our programming that we support to work directly with startups, and then the incubators and accelerators around the country that support them to really accelerate the clean tech ecosystem. So excited to talk about that here today. I've been here at Wells for about 2.5 years now. I came to Wells actually from a startup myself. I was at a clean tech startup for several years prior to joining Wells. And as Scott said, have a long history in corporate sustainability, in fact, with my fellow panelists and from AT&T, in fact, where I was on the sustainability team there and at DirecTV prior to that. So really excited to be here. I think this is a really interesting panel and topic, and hopefully the audience is going to get a lot of really useful perspective on what corporate innovation and engagement with the early stage community looks like. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you, Ramsey. Next up, we'll switch to the startup side and speak to Orlando Saez, who's the CEO of Acre, co-founder and CEO, I should say, an agriculture diagnostic data and service company based in the Midwest. Orlando has a super interesting background, including operating experience as a C-level in 2 early stage companies with exits, successful exits, but also getting into the farming world. And I'd love for him to tell a bit more of that story on how he got to where he is today. So Orlando, do you mind just filling us in?
Thank you, Scott. And that's a long story. However, I invented myself. I think that we'll punt on that one for another topic.
Okay, but, fair enough.
Delighted to be here. Thank you for the U.S. Chamber, and thank you for the accident that brought me here. Which largely has to do with Ramsey and Wells Fargo, since we are a company, a grantee for the IN2 program. So my name is Orlando Saez. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Acre. Started my career in the telecommunications space, and I did also work at AT&T. So, and that's to you. 6 years ago, my curiosity led me to agriculture. I lived in a farm for several years, and that was the idea of the genesis of Acre. Acre is a crop diagnostic company. We work to essentially match problems in the field that growers don't know about, because in corn and soybeans, they don't understand where pest pathogens, insect, and weeds occur. And we help them spray so that financially they make the right decision, and they also apply only where exactly is needed in order to reduce the excess pesticide use and reduce or manage the human footprint. So we're excited to be part of this program, and glad to be here today.
Fantastic. Thanks, Orlando. That was good. We'll dive into the whole backstory another time, but really interesting stuff. And then Anne, who's been brought up already a few times, Anne Wintraub, we're so glad to have you with us, Director of Social Innovation at the AT&T Foundation. Anne really leads the AT&T Aspire Accelerator for EdTech startups and built the AT&T Social Innovation portfolio. But she's also developed programs with partners including Google, Warner Media, and Khan Academy, made some incredible progress for children across the Bay Area in a variety of roles and capacities. And just a few pieces here, previously Deputy Director for the San Francisco Public Library Foundation and Director of Communications for KQED Public Broadcasting. So much great work for the community and others. So Anne, do you mind introducing yourself with a little bit more about what you do for AT&T?
Certainly. And thank you to Scott and to the U.S. Chamber for having us. It's a pleasure to be joined by former colleagues and new friends. The AT&T community is a broad one. So yes, Scott, I lead social innovation for the AT&T Foundation, which is primarily about our work in education, driving innovations in education, and pursuing really positive impacts and outcomes for young people all across the country and beyond. So my work with AT&T is national. Scott, thank you so much for referring, to my local work outside of AT&T here in the Bay Area where I live. But I'm really pleased to share with you all more about our accelerator. I think it's really important to note that our accelerator is housed within our foundation. So we are really an impact-first accelerator that includes both for and nonprofits. And Scott, I know we'll talk more about that later on.
Perfect. Thanks, Anne. And last but certainly not least, I want to introduce Hee-Jae Lim, CEO of Talking Points, who's had her interactions with the AT&T team, and that's what brings her here today. She's the founder and CEO of Talking Points, which is an education technology nonprofit with the mission to drive student success by unlocking the potential of families to fuel their children's learning, especially in underserved communities. Hee-Jae, you have an incredible story to talk about, and seeing as a Korean immigrant, sort of personal experience that led you to founding this nonprofit, but also has a long background, fantastic education, Oxford, McKinsey, and MBA from Stanford. So many accomplishments and an incredible background, and now here today with Talking Points. Can you give us a little bit more about what brought you here, the sort of interesting personal story, and then what you're doing with Talking Points and how you interacted with and worked with AT&T?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me here. I'm grateful to share the stage with you. So I am Hijay. I'm the founder and CEO of Talking Points. And I founded Talking Points in 2015, really based on my personal experience growing up. I was born in Korea. When I was 8, I moved to England with my family. Went to a local public elementary school. About 2/3 of the students there were Korean immigrant students. And my mom, who was studying for a graduate degree at the time, became kind of the de facto parent leader in the school community, translating for a lot of the parents who weren't able to access the information that the schools were pushing out, and kind of saw the impact that that had on me and my sister at the time. And little did I realize, fast forward, academic research actually shows that family teacher connections is twice as effective at predicting student success than their socioeconomic status. So Talking Points, we run a multilingual family engagement platform that allows parents and teachers to communicate with each other through web, mobile, and SMS, especially in under-resourced, diverse communities. And as you can imagine, COVID-19 has just propelled family engagement to the top of the priority list for a lot of the school and districts. So we are now reaching about 3 million families nationwide. And in AT&T has just been so supportive of our kind of exponential growth in the last 5 years. So grateful to be here, and thanks, Scott.
Awesome. Thanks, EJ. I think just wanted to remind the audience we're going to move to the next session. So speak specifically with Ramsey and Ann a little bit more on the corporate strategies. And just a reminder that we're going to take questions at the end, but please feel free to submit that throughout. Great. I think we're going to transition now. So Ramsey and Ann, maybe for each of you, set the stage for us a little bit on when and why did the program you lead get started? It seems like there's always an interesting story on the genesis of the program. And we spoke about this earlier, how each organization has a lot of nuances between strategy teams and innovation teams and their incubators, their accelerators. Maybe some of them have none of those things. So just help us understand how it got started and where you sit within the organization today. We have the fortunate advantage of having someone from an AT&T and at Wells Fargo. You've got a massive organization in AT&T with so much reach and impact, and a big bank like Wells Fargo, a core piece of our economy. And those organizations can be complex to navigate. So it'd be great to know, how it got started and where you all sit in those organizations today.
Great. I'm happy to take that, Scott. So we are currently in our 6th year of our accelerator program. And I mentioned that AT&T's focus for more than 10 years now has been education. We have invested more than $600 million, empowering students to be successful and to prepare for their eventual careers and the rest of their lives. So the accelerator for us came from a process, interestingly, Ramsey, around the time of our DirecTV acquisition. It came from the recognition that our approach at that point, and this is about 7 years ago, with our philanthropy was deeply data-driven, and we were working with really established organizations with proven track records of efficacy in serving students, teachers, and families. And that's terrific, and that is still a core tenet of what we do today. However, we were missing an opportunity to support, what could potentially be the future leading organizations in education and specifically in EdTech by not being a part of the EdTech community. And given the resources of AT&T, by not really driving that innovation. So we started the accelerator, again, out of the AT&T Foundation, really from that impact perspective that we needed to be more deeply involved in the change making that was starting to happen in education and specifically around education technology at that time. And that's continued really to be the motivator for the accelerator today. The program itself, as I mentioned, is housed within our foundation, but it is deeply connected to all aspects of our business, from our 5G team to our marketing team to our education sales team. So my team and I work really feverishly to ensure that we are deeply embedded within our culture as a company and within our business colleagues' goals. I think that's ultimately been very successful to the internal success of the accelerator. And of course, then it's leaders like Hijay who are responsible for the incredible external impacts that our companies are making. Together, our 43 companies are impacting more than 35 million students. They've gone on to collectively raise more than $45 million. So we're really looking to both, have those internal impacts on a company, as you said, with the scale and gravity of AT&T, and also first and foremost, those external impacts as we really drive for education, for change and progress in education at all times, but particularly today.
Awesome. Thanks, Anna. Follow-up question to that, and then we'll go back to Ramsey. But can you maybe paint a little bit of a picture? I know AT&T is broad and complex, but what are some of the other maybe innovation or incubation activities that are happening within AT&T? And I guess, how do you collaborate with them? Or, oftentimes they may just have very different impacts or purposes, and they sort of run on their own direction. Can you speak to any of those just to give some context?
Yeah, I think certainly I can. There's, innovation and there's innovation work happening all across AT&T. And of course, that now means, AT&T and our wonderful colleagues all across Warner Media, at HBO, at Warner Brothers. So, Scott, it isn't a simple question to answer. What I'll say, I mentioned what we're doing with our 5G team, for example. So, whether it's establishing then what use cases can look like in education with, our teams who are thinking through the impacts of 5G on healthcare, on education, on social services. We tend to collaborate when we are bringing technologies to life and really bringing technologies for good, in having, again, a really dynamic group of alumni, and also an active program that's working with, 8 different organizations every year, bringing technology to students, families, and teachers.
Awesome. I think that's really helpful for the audience. Okay, great. And then Ramsey, I'll shoot over to you really quickly. So, do you mind giving the same background? So, how the program that you lead got started, where you sit in the organization?
Yeah, you bet. And not surprisingly, a lot of what Ann just described there is pretty relevant, I would say, for us as well. So as far as where the program sits in the organization, it is a philanthropic endeavor of the Wells Fargo Foundation. It's now, INT is now a $50 million philanthropic commitment that was launched in 2014. So I sit within the larger enterprise level public affairs team and have responsibility for working across the enterprise. So much like Ann described, I work with partners throughout the business. In our case, that might include bankers who directly work with some of the companies that come through a program like IN2. It could be with my partners in the renewable energy or the clean tech banking team. It could be partners within our corporate bank, as we have clients who are also engaged in innovation. So, my role is intentionally very cross-cutting, and we see IN2 as a bit of a proverbial tip of the spear, if you will, a leading indicator, if you will, of our commitment to clean technology, particularly technology that helps lead that transition to a low-carbon economy. And where the program came from, like so many things that are entrepreneurial in nature, we saw a really substantial problem that there wasn't a solve for otherwise. And in this case, that problem was the dramatic implosion of venture capital dollars that were flowing into the clean technology sector post-2010. And we said, from a climate perspective, from a sustainability perspective, this problem hasn't gone away. It's simply that there's not capital being allocated against it now. And so the reason it's philanthropic is we wanted to fill in the wedges, the gaps, if you will, in that ecosystem in a way that we thought could help really accelerate the push forward for technology. And so we do 3 things in particular to support the ecosystem. One is we've got a network for identifying promising companies. That's how we found Orlando and Acre, for instance, right? We have a ability to validate that technology. That's where the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and the Danforth Plant Science Center come in and support these companies. And then third, importantly, we demonstrate and scale that technology. And so that is solving for challenges that any one venture firm or any one corporate, I think, would have quite a lot of difficulty doing by themselves. And I think of our philanthropy, frankly, these days as actually supporting an entirely new process. This was a new public-private partnership. No one had actually attempted something like this between a national laboratory and a private corporation. And so what we've done is actually prove out that you can do this, and it's a successful mechanism for accelerating promising technology at scale. And last thing I'll say just real quick, as far as like how we work with the rest of the business, you may be wondering why Wells Fargo is involved with a company like Acre, right? Somebody that's in the agricultural space. Well, Wells is the largest lender and has been for more than 20 years to the agricultural sector, really from farm to fork, whether it's at the farm and producer level, all the way through the ag value chain to the food companies, grocery, restaurant, you name it. We're at all pieces of that value chain. And so it's really important to us that we're supporting innovations within the ag tech space that align both with our core competency in working with that sector and our sustainability objectives. As you heard Orlando describe his company, he'll probably tell you more about this. They're focused on how do you reduce inputs, which is obviously improves the economics for the farmer and reduces the impacts from a environmental and sustainability perspective. So trying to solve for a variety of challenges through some unique programming like this.
That's awesome. Thank you, Ramsey. That's a great example and good deep dive on how Wells Fargo is making a sort of unique impact in a problem without a solve. I know for Engage, one of the things that always stood out to us was where we were limited and hampered by the sort of venture capital model. What we did try to fix a problem without a great solve was how do you commercialize innovation out of research universities into the hands of corporates outside of maybe sponsored projects and research, but really, organizations, companies that are getting started and need to achieve some sort of scale. And so we've tried to work through that challenge, and we've been impressed to see how many corporations really are passionate about, interested in piloting and testing some of those new technologies. And so it's kudos to forward-thinking organizations like a Wells and AT&T and others. But really quick tactical question, Ramsey, you talked a little bit about how you find companies. I know that's always an interesting challenge for our corporates that we work with as well. And do you mind talking to that? I mean, what's your process? How do you find companies to work with and evaluate them?
I love that question. We are always recruiting. We're never not recruiting. And we have such an incredible community of entrepreneurs who we've worked with. And I can't stress the importance of that enough. It's not just about the class that you're running, but it's about continuing to cultivate your community, because that pipeline, that's really where we get so many of our excellent companies. And we also think in a field like education, creating and fostering that community from the beginning of these companies' journey is so important to propelling their growth. Totally
agree. Awesome. That's really helpful. So now, while we're talking with Anne, can you give me a sense, how does your organization measure success? And I know you talked a little bit about the number of companies you've worked with, the students you've reached. So maybe those are the key metrics. But as you think about measuring success and then communicating that internally to the rest of the organization, what are some best practices, some tips for folks that are in the audience that might be in your similar shoes?
Yeah, and you're right, Scott. I mean, with regard to ROI, we think about both ROI and, ROL, right? Return on learning. And that, of course, gets to the external impacts, which I've spoken about previously. And I would say, and Ramsey, you probably feel similarly about this. What's so important to the success of the accelerator is, really creating a deep sense of pride across AT&T in what this program is, because it is really different. And it is not something that I think, at least a few years ago, it isn't something that would have been expected from a company like AT&T. So we take every opportunity we can to, really create a sense of pride for the accelerator. So, every year, our graduation that we do for our class, that's a big event. Last year, we did a program with Mark Cuban in Dallas that we broadcast out to all of our employees. This year, it will be with Sal Khan and Mia Bialik on December 2nd. So we're really seeking to bring great voices together with the accelerator to really instill that sense of pride. And then I'll also say that, just as we continue to cultivate our community of alumni, we're also continuing to work with and empower, entrepreneurs like EJ, whether through additional contributions, whether through, one of our alumni, Career Village, which is crowdsourcing for career advice, that now is a primary platform for our employee engagement. So we're always seeking to embed the accelerator both as a program within, the culture of AT&T, and then to bring different companies to solve problems or challenges or needs of colleagues across the business, not just in CSR, but beyond as well.
Great. That's awesome. Ramsey, what about on your side? What are some of the unique challenges, I guess, of communicating ROI in a Wells Fargo and finance environment as well? How do you think about that and translating to the bottom line, the cultural impact? How do you manage that from your team?
Sure. Yeah, and we look at it, I think in a number of ways, right? Like these are, for-profit companies. The way the philanthropy works is to support the programming and that the companies benefit from that programming, right? And so we very much focus on, how successful these companies are. So a couple of metrics, that I like to always bring up when I have this conversation is, how are we doing on job creation? And we've seen the companies that have come through the program now create more than 400 jobs since they joined the program. So substantial growth. Most of them have roughly doubled their employee count. How are they doing on follow-on funding? We've seen the companies come through our program receive $383 million as of the end of close of Q3 in follow-on funding, and that is not from like a small firm that you might not have heard of. That is from Breakthrough Energy Ventures, the fund that Bill Gates is involved with, from Steve Case's Rise of the Rest, for instance. And that leads me to the third point, which is we're also very interested in diversity and inclusion in this program. And so we have taken a very strategic view of geographic inclusion. If you think about where we as a country, if you ask the proverbial man or woman on the street and they said, where does innovation happen in the United States? They're going to raise their hand and say Silicon Valley. They're going to raise their hand and they're going to say Boston. And that is absolutely true. And we're absolutely show up in those places. But you know what? Orlando came to us from Minnesota. He came to us through an incubator in Chicago. So it's happening throughout the Midwest. It's happening with diverse colleges like University, or I should say Texas State University, San Marcos, where we have a partnership there that's growing our ag tech program. So if you look across the country, there are incredible incubators who are supporting the innovators that are out there. And so that's kind of the third leg of the stool for us. What are we doing to find the really promising, diverse and inclusive opportunities that this can align with our small business and diversity objectives? So it's quite an honor to lead a program that has this incredible financial metric with it, as well as the impact metric, both from a sustainability and a job creation perspective.
Great. Yeah, I think I'll just touch on that for a second, because it's just super important to our mission, as well as this sort of regional awareness of the kind of great technology, the incredible founders that are coming out of regions that aren't necessarily San Francisco or Boston, but a big piece of ours is Atlanta and the Southeast. And really one of the things that we've been trying to work through and figure out, a thesis we wanted to test, is can you build your innovation teams in where you're headquartered? For us, it's in Atlanta or in the Southeast, or do you have to fly those teams out to San Francisco? And I think it's been unique to find out that, one, there's a ton of talent and things to connect with in your hometown. And then two, that people get on planes. I mean, maybe not today. COVID's made things much different in the year of 2020, but in general, innovation travels and they'll come to you. So it has definitely been an interesting time to try to pilot more regional focused strategies. And did you want to touch on that too?
Yeah, no, I'm nodding aggressively because I
good.
So important. And Ramsey, I'm so glad to learn more about your approach. We too have taken a really similar approach. And I wanted to jump in just to note, if anyone out there is considering, creating an accelerator, how important it is to design for, geographic inclusivity as well as DEI from the very beginning. So from the beginning, our accelerator was a virtual one. The pivot to COVID was not a challenge for us because we wanted to allow for parents to be a part of the accelerator, for former teachers to be a part of the accelerator. It is not everybody who can pick up and move to a Silicon Valley or a Boston or a New York or an Austin for 6 months. So I just wanted to jump in, Scott, just to, assert that we also share that value. More than 70% of our founders are women, more than 50% are people of color, and just, the tip to really design for that from the very beginning of your program.
Great. Yeah, there's a good amount of questions flying in right now about those pieces, which is awesome. Let me I'll ask one that was posed specifically by the audience. Before I do that, though, this is just a great topic to pull that thread a little bit more. What's unique about the corporate accelerator, either mission or purpose or structure, that enables you to work better or at least more prevalently with diverse minority founders, maybe founders in rural locations? If you look across the venture landscape, you know what the numbers are, but I do feel like the corporate incubation and accelerator space is doing a great job of sort of flipping that on its head. So maybe from one or each of you, what about the structure or the mission or purpose enables you to work better in furthering those goals?
Yeah, I'll take that, Scott. I mean, I would say from our perspective, we were built, obviously as Ann was as well, from the ground up with a focus on impact. And so for us, this is a natural part of our mission. So we weren't built to solve a particular corporate innovation challenge per se. That wasn't what we're trying to do, right? We're not, a fintech accelerator. Wells Fargo does in fact have a fintech accelerator, and that is something we focus on within the company. But this one was impact oriented from day one, and so I think for us that meant identifying impact within the output. What is the product the company is actually doing, or what problem are they solving? But also, who are they? What do they represent, and what is their capability? And for us, I think recognizing the national footprint of Wells Fargo and where the challenges that we were working on, whether it's agriculture, building tech, construction tech, those are not necessarily things that are software problems to be solved in an office building somewhere in Silicon Valley. And it really does mean being out in those communities and being part of that conversation with people on the ground doing construction, farmers in the field solving real problems. So I think for us, it's just a very natural outgrowth of what we're doing. And we're leaning in even harder on that as we go forward with the program. So much more to come.
Awesome. Well, we have, I'm trying to stick to the clock, 42 seconds left. So with time running out, one of the questions from the audience was, do your programs enable your employees, the corporates, to interact with the startups, leverage their skills, especially in COVID times, and connect remotely? Do your programs do that?
Yeah, I can take that. Certainly, and that's a great question. Our programs do that, and it's twofold. It's connecting our employees with the accelerator program. We are always reaching out to connect, experts within different working groups at AT&T. Again, whether that's about sales or whether that's about marketing or whether that's about storytelling. And that doesn't need to be a senior level executive. In fact, often it's folks at very different stages in their careers who are most helpful to our companies. And then also, our alumni now is 43 companies. We have 8 new companies in our class. We're also always connecting those individual companies with colleagues who are driving work streams that, that our accelerator companies can help to benefit.
Perfect. Nailed it. Thank you, Ann. Okay, great. Well, up next, we'll bring on the founders to tell you more about their experience. Okay, great. So we've got Orlando and Hije. So thanks for waiting there for a little bit. I want to talk to you more about your experience going through these awesome programs. Kind of similar to how I kicked it off with Ann and Ramsey. Can you tell us more about just the beginnings, the context? At what point did you decide to explore entering a corporate accelerator program? How did you stumble upon these programs? If you could just give me the background context to start us off, that'd be great. Orlando, why don't you kick us off and then we'll go to Hije.
Happy to do that. So I guess the main motivation for us and for me personally is one that is an outlier maybe for some other folks. I was a executive in the telecommunications space and I had to reinvent myself. And I went into farming and I lived in a farm for 3 years. The only way that you can get third-party validation is having a sponsor that can actually bring that credibility up once you make that transition. So the only way that we can do that is to apply to accelerators that were in the space, because they're the stranger enough in the team to be able to understand and appreciate that what you're doing and giving you credit for the fact that, hey, you're a proven entrepreneur, you've done this before, but you're in a completely different space. There is a lot of access that is needed, especially in agriculture, in order to develop a platform, especially ours, which is a B2B. So for us, access to that network was powerful. The other thing that I would say that I think is relevant to a follow-up on Ramsey, it's a very important nuance, is how does Wells Fargo get to us, a small company in Minnesota? Well, they didn't get to us. We kind of got to them. It takes a village. We had won a accelerator in Chicago called the Clean Energy Trust in 2018. We were the winners of the challenge, and that was a interesting coming out in terms of being on a small farm and moving into a big city and having a spotlight that was more national. Wells Fargo was a sponsor of the Clean Energy Trust. And so when they went to recruit companies for the IN2, Wells Fargo doesn't have any agricultural background as well. They reach out to a number of groups that allow them to reach out to companies like us. So it takes a village. So it's a broad journey to get to where we are. And this is part of the excitement. How these serendipity connections make sense in terms of reaching out, relevance, and the excitement of us working with Wells Fargo and what we're doing is significant. And the reason we are excited of working in the IN2 today, which is the program that we received 2 grants already. We're headquarters at the Danforth Plant Science Center, which is the world's largest NGO plant science in the world, doing some incredible work. Acre is a technology company, so we're a whole bunch of engineers, we're techies. We needed a science foundation to what we're doing to balance the impact that we need to reach. And so bringing that intersection of technology and science, having an investor like Wells Fargo to support that journey and translating innovation into the market, it's a perfect storm. So we're delighted to be part of that for the last 2 years now.
Fantastic. That's a great story. And again, just great serendipity on how big organizations like Wells Fargo can be reaching organizations like yours, Orlando, and really what you can bring back to Wells Fargo and broadly, for your missions and your purpose for your company. EJ, do you mind doing the same kind of thing? So context on how you started thinking about joining a program and really why you made the decision to go into it in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. So we joined AT&T Aspire Accelerator in 2016. So the context is, I think we applied about 8 months into me starting to work on Talking Points full time. So it was a super young startup. At the time, we were serving about hundreds of families, zero earned revenue, a very limited funding. So we needed all the things that, Orlando mentioned, including, credibility and brand awareness that AT&T as a Fortune 500 company brings, some technological support, given that we do work with mobile app technology and SMS. We also wanted, a cohort and a community of entrepreneurs that Anne mentioned. I think, in fact, we found AT&T Aspire, which at the time was in their second year of running, through other entrepreneurs in the kind of the education technology community. And, all the things that AT&T were able to kind of provide were those, right? So it helped us with our growth, brand awareness, tech support, among many other things. So, at the time we were just starting out, and there was no questions asked about the value that an accelerator like AT&T Aspire would bring to Talking Points. And here we are 5 years later.
So great. And I can see Anne smiling on the back end here. So this is, if I pause for a second, these are some of my favorite parts about doing things like this, is when you really find those successful moments of shared value that you create working startup to corporate. And those are big breakthroughs, and usually brings smiles to people's faces. So awesome stuff. Well, don't worry. In a little bit, we'll get to the pros and cons of the accelerator. So you guys can talk, you can dish the dirt on some of the things that did work and didn't work. We're used to hearing that all the time on our end. But before we go into that, do you mind just talking a little bit about, some of the things I picked out of both of your stories was working with a Wells Fargo or an AT&T might provide credibility. There may have been capital that was valuable for your startup at that time, access or scale. So whether that was a partnership or maybe an underlying partnership with technology or, global reach. So as you weigh some of those different things, what was most important to you heading in? And maybe what did you find after the program you find most important today? For instance, I find sometimes it's the capital number, and step number one is just find a way to get the business off the ground, and you leave the program realizing that the impact or the scale or the credibility might have even been more important than the grant or the capital. But it's different for every startup. So TJ, why don't you start that one off. But, among those different value propositions, what were you excited about going in, and then maybe realized afterwards too that more valuable than you thought?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you asked that, Scott. So I think, going in, I was just at the point of really wanting to get it off the ground. I think at the time, AT&T aspires, capital kind of philanthropic contributions, about $100,000. That was a lot for us at the time of having raised, let's say, $500,000 cumulatively. Now we're in double-digit millions. So if you think about kind of the size of the organization, what that funding meant to us, it was a lot. I think, as you exactly mentioned, Scott, what the value that we have since derived from our relationship with AT&T is so much more than the $100,000 per year contribution. So those include, the entrepreneurs that I have met through the community and the network, through AT&T Aspire, continue to be friends, peers that I go to with a ton of questions. How are you doing HR? How are you doing payroll? What does it mean in terms of recruiting a management team? I would say, credibility and marketing was a huge one. So as someone running an organization that is, penetrating school and school districts and educators, and often they ask us, who are your supporters? Where does your funding come from? And it helps a ton that AT&T has a real relationship with the education ecosystem through broadband, through access to technology, and they even sponsored kind of our attendance in major conferences. We haven't spent a single marketing dollar to date on advertising. The entire growth has been word of mouth, but it's conferences that AT&T has sponsored under their kind of co-branding with Talking Point that's really helped us grow. I would say, again, I'm going back to the technological partnership, because AT&T's business in, let's say, SMS and mobile, we've been able to, really accelerate some of our deliverability around parents getting the text messages because of the contacts that we've had within AT&T. And to do that outside in, I think it would have taken us years, given how complex and large AT&T as a company is. So all of those, and of course the funding, but I think I would rank the capital kind of that we were so excited about at the time, probably at the lowest end of the kind of the priority list and the value add. So yeah.
Great. That's perfect. And I find we have a similar experience with a lot of the startups that go through Engage. We're a follow-on investor as well. We are more from the venture standpoint, but we typically look for a lead VC to lead the rounds, and then we follow on. So there's capital, and it's always important, in that moment. And then we find that ideally you land a few customers, a strategic partnership that leads to the non-dilutive forms of capital, the revenue coming in the door, the new strategic partnerships that open new markets for you. Those tend to pay dividends down the road. But that was really insightful. Thank you. What about you, Orlando? What were the big revelations for you as you went through the program?
Geez, what am I not excited about? It's going to take too long, but I'll summarize it in this. So the first one, and we talked about it, is your reputational validation, right? But we cover that. I think the other two that I would summarize is, one is value thesis and the other one is community. And so let me talk about the value thesis because I think this is important. Acre would not be possible if we didn't get what I call, and we joke affectionately about this. If you know the show Big Bang Theory, we are the Howard Wolowitz. We're the engineers, and the Danforth Center has a whole bunch of Sheldon Coopers. There's 250 PhD, crazy smart people there doing genetic stuff and crazy stuff. And so the first thing that I walk in is a conception of the world as I see it in terms of what we've been working for the last couple of years. So as a typical startup, we got this. We understand this. When we start talking with 250 guys that are uber smart, understand agriculture far better than we know, have global access, they completely take what we do, which is essentially we have our novelty as a drone. So we created a drone to be able to use as a mechanism to diagnose farms. And we can put all kinds of sensors. The opportunity to work with Danforth Sensor to expand the value thesis of what we do was remarkable. So that's the first thing. We thought we had it figured out. We were not even close. They expanded that tenfold. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and it goes a little bit to what, Ramsey measures and what all the sponsors want to hear is for us as community. We added a new community to our roster. We were in Minnesota. We moved to St. Louis. If you know much about St. Louis, or if you don't, there's a small company in St. Louis called Monsanto, now owned by Bayer Crop Science, the largest agricultural company in the world. It's a small player in the industry. All that nexus of innovation happens in St. Louis. So if you want to do anything related to agriculture, you need to be in St. Louis. So this allowed us the opportunity to be there, to grow there. When we started the program, we had 3 employees. Now we have 11 full-time and 30 nationwide. So it goes back to this idea of what impact from a workforce perspective we have, but it's really about increasing the value, adding, new folks into what we're doing that can extend the value thesis of what we provide. And I can talk for this for hours, so I'll stop there.
That's great. You got to love to hear those success stories. Thanks, Orlando. Well, I'm sure the audience also wants to hear, what are, as you think about all of these positives, the pluses, the sort of impact that you can benefit from, what are some of the considerations? What were some of the drawbacks? Maybe even if it's just challenges. Orlando, it seems like we've both spoken about the various ways to get introduced to a company and finding the right door. And as you put, getting your vendor ID. So there are challenges with working with corporations. It seems like, to the credit of Ann and Ramsey, you all have taken down some of those walls and made it easier to partner. But what are some of the considerations if you're a founder or a startup entrepreneur thinking about joining a program? What are some of the considerations, drawbacks, or challenges that you've faced?
I'm happy to take that, but I need to make a turn because, again, we're an agricultural company and we are involved in a accelerator that is supported by a bank. We're not, the corporate program that we're working, they're not a customer, right? So we're using their funding as a way to approach other enterprise. So I'm going to speak about kind of what you mentioned there, which I think is important, which is, what's the path of getting a vendor ID with some of these big companies? And we knock on doors of the big companies, and we're lucky enough to have a vendor ID with BSF, with Bayer, with Syngenta, with FMC. These are massive companies. So how is it that a small potato, small set of guys can go to a big company and get that vendor ID? So I think some of the challenges related to that are, the typical. You have to approach an enterprise like a marketplace. There are influencers, there are buyers, there are users. You need to do like a 5-force, Michael Porter analysis on the enterprise to be able to know how to figure it out. And so ultimately what you need is a sponsor. And the sponsor has to be either a buyer, an influencer with enough political capital that is willing to take a risk. Because part of the big challenges with enterprises is understanding that the livelihood of that particular manager is on the line by taking a risk with a startup, whether it's ours or EJ or any other entrepreneur. So the question becomes, how do you frame that properly? Well, they need to be a little bit crazy, what I call as we are crazy, because we are looking at the world in a different way. And that craziness or that idea of disrupting the status quo has to be a shared value by both sides, the sponsor and the entrepreneur. Once you have that alignment, the entire journey is all about how do you get it done? And it's finding the pilot opportunity. How do you create the small aspect of this? And I'll give you some of the challenges for us working to get a vendor ID. Insurance requirements. These vendors or these companies are used to working with big companies, so they expect you to have $10 million liability insurance and all kinds of things. Well, we don't. That's one example. The other one is payment terms. We have a couple of companies that have payment terms in their accounts payable that is 120 days. So from the time that you complete the job to the time that you get paid is 4 months and, in arrears. That's punitive to startups. So finding the right sponsor that can have either local budget or a credit card that he can use to be able to drive value, to create an opportunity to demonstrate your technology. It's kind of how we've worked it out to be creative. So I'll stop there, but those are just some examples.
Awesome. That's perfect. Those specific examples I think are really helpful. EJ, we've got about a minute and a half. Do you mind sharing your thoughts as well? I mean, partly in terms of, the AT&T program, but even as Orlando expanded, just generally working with enterprise, what are some of the challenges and your strategies too, and how you face those?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a couple of considerations if I were to, think about what does it look like for a founder's decision making in joining a corporate accelerator. I think the mission needs to be very aligned. So in terms of, our relationship with AT&T Aspire, impact and education and student outcomes was very aligned. The way that we do that was very aligned through technology and keeping people connected. I think, second consideration is, are you just doing it for the financials and the cash contribution? Because there is so much more to an accelerator. I have been part of accelerators where it can take time on the part of the entrepreneur or the management team. So that's just a consideration in terms of, how can you be removed from the day-to-day operations of running a company? I would say, I think thinking, forward, what's on my mind is, what does growth capital look like as someone who's running now a pretty large nonprofit? We were at 25 FTEs. We're looking at about 70 people in the next 2 years' time, kind of also tripling our reach. So where does that come from? What does that look like? Where does talent and staffing come from? What does that mean to be in this remote work environment? So, all the things that any startup is going through in terms of the growth stage. And what does that mean in terms of our relationship with other enterprises as well?
Perfect. Awesome. Thanks. Well, I think we're at time for that session. So I think we'll move on now, and we'll bring everybody back to discuss together best ways to create shared value. Awesome. There we go. Everybody's here. This feels a little bit like the Today Show. I'm excited to say maybe a more miniature version of the Today Show. But well, thanks for everybody for coming back. I think before I kick it off, I want to remind everybody, keep the questions coming. They're feeding them to me in the background. So we will leave it open for Q&A toward the end. I think that we've got about 20 minutes for this session, and the rest will be Q&A. But would love to work that in to this session, because this is really meant to be tactical, focused on the best ways to work together and create shared value. And so I'm sure there's some specifics on people's minds in the audience. So happy to field those. But just to kick things off, and I think where Orlando was headed with that was actually a really great transition into the realities of how do you get that vendor ID? What are some strategies to break through? And I thought, EJ, you also mentioned weighing the prospects of entering into a corporate accelerator and making sure your vision and mission is aligned. So why don't we dive first, EJ? I want you to maybe double tap on that a little bit. And specific to, I know with Engage, we've had the experience where you sort of get out of it what you put into it, in the sense that when the founder is present and when a meaningful part of the team is really dug in on building the deep relationships, and maybe to Orlando's point, navigating the marketplace that is a corporation in terms of finding your champion and your buyer and lining them up. And so this really goes a long way to ensure that the effort you put into it tends to result in big results coming out of it. But we all know, as an entrepreneur and as a startup running a small business, there's a lot of demands on your time, very little capital to do what you need to do. So can you talk more from a personal standpoint, what it was like weighing that decision? Where do you devote your resources and time and talents and effort and capital? And how did you kind of make that decision in terms of this was a good allocation of time and energy and resources, which it clearly was?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can get started, but perhaps Anne can add on after from the accelerator's perspective. So, at the time, it was a no-brainer for us. That was for a couple of reasons. One was the fact that there was very little in-person time required. As Anne mentioned, it has been virtual for a while. So it meant that the kind of supports that we got from the AT&T accelerator didn't require that much travel. It was, via phone call or, video conferencing, which made a world of a difference. And of course, we would get together as a cohort and a community of entrepreneurs a couple of times a year, but that wasn't too demanding on my time. It it is and continues to be a balancing act. So I think, 5 years forward, when I'm thinking about kind of my role now as CEO, it's a lot of it is management and leadership, which wasn't the case back in the day when you have a team of, 3 people, 3 to 5 people, and you have to deal with day-to-day operations. I think it would be kind of just an anecdote to share there, to kind of make my case in point is, as a small startup, AT&T gave us the opportunity to present talking points to the entire board of directors at AT&T. I mean, it's one of the top kind of companies in the US, and when do you get the access and the opportunity to do that? So great opportunity for us. We were in the boardroom for a couple of hours. I come out of the meeting, and it turns out that our servers were down, apps were down, SMS deliverability was down, the biggest bug to date. So that just highlights, what kind of balancing act it was at the time, in terms of managing, cultivating long-term relationships, balancing that with day-to-day operations. And I have to say, these relationships have lasted over time, right? So it's not just over the course of a 6 months accelerator, 5 years on, there is a reason Anna and I are on this panel together. So that's lots of learnings, but still growing and still learning for us.
Awesome. Thanks, CJ. I think there's really a lot to say to that relationship 5 years down the road, and kudos to Anne on fostering that kind of relationship. Maybe I will kick it to you really quickly. How do you ensure, I'm sure we think about this on our side, I'm sure you do as well, how to drive the best value for your startups, sort of bang for the buck? And I think doing it remotely as you have pre-COVID was seemingly a great strategy. So maybe what other things have you done to try to match that value with the time requirements or whatever it may be?
Yeah, it's a great question, Scott. I don't think I've mentioned this yet, but our accelerator, it's a customized experience for the organizations that we invite to join. So we spend a lot of time within our selection process, and every year we get between 300 and 500 applicants for 8 spots. So it's really, really competitive. And we're not just looking for the ventures that we believe are most poised for success. I mean, of course we're looking for that, but we're also looking to build a really dynamic cohort. And B, we're looking to make sure that we can create a customized program that will propel the companies, right? I mean, we're really clear about the assets and resources and human capital that AT&T has, and where we can best put that to use for the sake of the growth of our entrepreneurs. So we're selecting from the beginning for that purpose. And then I think, because the program itself is customized, we have a terrific entrepreneur in residence and team who's working, day to day in largely a virtual capacity to propel the growth of our companies. And then, as TJ said, we would get together a couple of times a year, and those experiences together in different cities, sometimes tied to a conference, sometimes tied to an AT&T event, sometimes just a place with a really vibrant ed tech community, where we're going to learn more and to showcase our companies. Those experiences we also designed really deliberately to be both as rich and beneficial as possible for the companies, and also just frankly as enjoyable. So we do a lot of breaking bread together and really getting to know one another. I think everybody affiliated with this program, both the core team that runs it with me and our colleagues all across AT&T, we're really bringing our hearts and minds to this work. And I think that's really been critical to making sure our entrepreneurs' time feels valued, and ensuring that, again, like 5 years down the line, here Hije and I are on panels, and Hije's incredible, and there are 40. Nobody's like Hije, but we have 40 plus other entrepreneurs who could also be sitting right there and sharing their own experiences and the depth of their connection with AT&T.
That's awesome. Thanks, Anne. Going back to Orlando, and then there's a question which I'll follow up with next. But I wanted to dig a bit deeper on maybe some best practices or some anecdotes you could share in terms of positioning yourself as a startup in order to prepare for some of these insurance demands, some of the payment terms. I always think of, in our experience, it's been, how do you share data, sometimes depending on, I guess, your type of customer and your solution, but the procurement process and legal. And then I'll kind of run it to Ramsey and just talk about what you've seen within Wells Fargo and how you're navigating some of those challenges. And obviously, as a regulated bank, the walls that you can't push on, the things that are in place for a reason. So maybe Orlando, how do you prepare for that? How do you weigh that considerations as a founder?
So I have two things. One is the forgiveness card, and the other one is competency. One of the things that I'm lucky, and there's a book that I recommend to everybody to read, which is Where Ideas Come From, which is this notion of tying innovation to natural evolution. The recent coral reefs are responsible for 90% or more than 90% of all the living species in the planet is because of proximity. So the adjacent possible is what makes things happen. So the equivalence for that for me is I've been lucky enough and very gifted to be a C-level executive in two companies that went public. And one of them was Boingo Wireless. And Boingo, I dealt a lot with airports, one of the most politically polluted places to do business. So once you get trained in that, believe me, you get your chops to be able to be successful doing anything, anywhere. So how do you get ready for that? It would have been very difficult for my co-founder, who had incredible chops in farming, to be able to go to a big company to actually present that innovation, no matter how technically and how much authorities he has in agriculture to make the case. So what I would say first is competency. You need to have a technical co-founder, a business co-founder side by side. You need to have an MVP team that can go and walk the talk associated with these things to be able to negotiate it. So that's one. And the second one is a forgiveness card. So case example, we go to a big company, we say, hey, we'd like to do business with you. We find the sponsor, we triangulate everything we can. And then they say, well, you don't meet this. Well, I have a get out of jail card, which is the Ramsey, Wells Fargo. We've been involved in Thrive Accelerator and Yield Labs and Clean Energy Trust. All these third-party validation becomes kind of the forgiveness currency, right? It's like, is there a way to lower the barrier because you have these many other supporters that are backing what we're doing? And so some cases you win some cases you lose. You take your winnings and keep running. So.
Awesome. That's great. And before I hand it over to Ramsey, I do want to focus in on that point a little bit, which is the team and how important that is. I think everybody across the board, either from the startup or the accelerator side, can talk to what it's been like to have a strong team, and then how we evaluate applicants and potential startups on our side, especially to invest in. Team is something you got to get right, and you're really backing that team. They own the vision, and oftentimes that competency is the difference between spending 9 months running in one direction versus 9 months in another direction. And that's all it takes to be successful. So definitely an encouragement to those entrepreneurs out there to really find that great team and pull all the pieces together in the puzzle. And it'll make the journey, I think, quite a lot better. So Ramsey, if you don't mind, touch on that from the corporate side. What are some of the challenges that you face as a regulated bank? What are some of those things that startups could do to help make it easier for you all, for instance? I know that in Orlando's case, you were really enabling him to expand to new customers and new markets. But as you think about Wells Fargo working directly with organizations, or startups, what are some of the things that would make it easier for you all, right, to navigate the challenges on your side?
Yeah, and I think it's important to circle back to what Orlando said a few minutes ago, which is he's an agricultural company. We're a bank. And those two wouldn't seem to be a natural fit otherwise. And so I think what's unique about our approach here is that we're focusing on this from a problem that we're looking to solve holistically, globally, however you want to describe it, from a sustainability perspective. So we didn't set out to say, okay, this is a problem this bank has, and let's solve it for ourselves. Or, corporation XYZ has this particular challenge we're looking to tackle. For us, rather, it was like, we've got this big area of interest we're looking to dive into. How could we best go about that? Maybe that's inside our four walls, maybe it's outside. Obviously, as you can tell, we chose to go outside the four walls, and I think we've been incredibly successful because of that. But I think for corporates, it really is about understanding what is your core competency, and when you're thinking about where these things touch upon that core competency, how do you benefit from that internally? And what is it that you're trying to achieve? And should you be the one to deliver on that, right? Just because you have a core competency that is aligned to, a specific outcome or specific capability doesn't necessarily mean that you should be hosting startups yourself that are working on that. for many of the reasons that Orlando alluded to, right? Rather, is there a way to work outside that system perhaps to deliver on that? And Scott, it sounds like a lot of the work you're doing is, aligned there too. And kudos to my fellow, corporate partners that are working with you guys and recognizing that, because I think there are a lot of different paths one can take to solve on this. And I would say for us, if you think about a bank, you think about your particular financial products, right? You think about offering, checking accounts or revolving line of credit, whatever it might be. Sure, we do that. That's a core competency. But we also are deeply embedded across the entirety of the economy. And so what that means is we have connectivity into lots of other areas within the economy. As I mentioned earlier, we're the largest lender within the agricultural economy. What does that mean? We have connectivity with clients all up and down that ag value chain. And so for someone like Orlando, he could pick up the phone and say, hey, we are looking to solve this challenge, or we have this particular problem. And we think these three companies might be ones that we should talk to. Do you guys at Wells Fargo have connectivity there? In most cases, the answer would probably be yes. And, we have a capability to make those sort of connections. So I think for us, it, feels a very interesting niche, and, allows us to, lean into what we do really well, but in a way that isn't necessarily like, okay, the company is going to become a vendor to us, because, again, as, he's describing, that probably wouldn't necessarily make a lot of sense.
If I can say, Scott, there's an interesting nuance that Ramsey and I share that I think might be important for the audience here, which is this. What we're doing together is actually falls in the category of wicked problems that the world needs to solve, right? How do you solve the food supply? How do you solve healthcare? How do you solve, governance? I mean, there's wicked problems. So this is a classic example of a company, Wells Fargo and Acre, having a little bit of that craziness in terms of how do we plot to go together to solve this problem. And so here's what's interesting that is important from a construction of accelerator. The Wells Fargo, they didn't say, oh, we're going to invite these companies and we're going to have domain expertise internally to be able to figure this out. And they didn't do that. What they said is, no, we're going to partner and find out who are the other crazy people that are trying to solve this wicked problem. And that's where they went to the National Renewable Energy Lab, through the clean tech portal, if you will, and landed in the Danforth Center to be able to say, let's pick this group to be able to architect the right way to drive an accelerator, the benefit of which to Acre is having somebody as a sponsor like Ramsey's group that is not necessarily trying to business model our way to success as other accelerators do. And I think that's a very powerful nuance that I think is incredibly powerful in the way of the genius of, how Wells Fargo decided to go into this and say, let's solve this wicked problem, and making real execution moves in a way that we're doing this together.
That's brilliant. Okay, great. Thank you for diving into that. And I do think that's underappreciated. And maybe to Ramsey's point, a lot of large corporates are beginning to think about how they can partner to make a change, as opposed to thinking of innovation purely as build or buy. And just as an anecdote for the audience on our side, we work with all of our corporate partners to try to digest their corporate strategy and think through how they look at innovation. And we've tried to narrow down a very, very complex process into push or pull. And it usually comes down to, you can kind of find out which group you're working with. Are they really pushing business issues out to the innovation ecosystem to find solutions? Or are they, sort of out meeting startups, open to new ideas, open to crazy teams focused on really hairy problems, and then pulling that back into the organization to find buyers and champions? And so I just encourage the startups to kind of think through which group is doing which type of innovation, and then positioning themselves appropriately. Because for instance, if you're working with someone who's pushing and you're trying to push a solution that doesn't match a business unit problem, you might be going up a steep hill. Great. Well, it's crazy, but we only have 5 minutes left. I do want to address some of the questions in the chat. The one most recently that came in is speaking to some of the challenges, and I think the things that have been presented to us more closely and more personally in 2020. But how has the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter, both of those movements, really impacted the programs and the strategy? And it sounds like really both and in Ramsey, your programs were built with impact centric from the bottom up. But what has 2020 done to change the way your program's focused on, or maybe not change much at all, but maybe provide some firepower into tackling these big, challenging problems? But yeah, just talk to us about that.
Yeah, Ramsey, I can jump in on that. So yeah, certainly I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't be so bold as to say that our accelerator, like, we got this, we're good with regard to Me Too and Black Lives Matter, because we all need to examine and change and grow as a result of everything that's happening in this world, which we most certainly have. And, for us, that's taken shape in a number of different ways. One, in the way, of course, that we're conducting our current class. And what that really means for us is supporting the way in which our companies are pivoting, right? So whether that means that they are, being more deliberate with how they talk about and address social issue, or how they talk about and address young people rising up their voices, and how we can help in amplifying that, just supporting, and in some cases, helping our companies to change and evolve to meet the needs of the current moment. And then with regard to COVID, of course, and the school closures, AT&T very swiftly, as soon as the impacts on schools were made clear in March of this year, we created a Distance Learning Family Connections Fund, a $10 million fund. And a certain proportion of that fund went to aiding many of our alumni, Hijay and Talking Points being one of them, who were facing unbelievable demand for their services and needed help scaling, particularly with regard to family engagement, tools that were helping teachers to transition, tools that were supporting, students in this new world of distance learning. So we've taken both, a supporting our companies in their pivots and growth approach, and then one that is specifically about, the systemic change and the resources that AT&T can bring to bear to propel this movement forward.
Great. Awesome. And Ramsey, any comments to that as well? I mean, you have sort of variety of impacts and metrics and goals for the program, but how has this year maybe changed the way you think about the program, or has it, or even just the way that the companies you partner with, like Orlando's company, how they've been interacting?
Yeah, and I'll answer really quickly. Two brief things. One, we took some funding that we had programmed to support our nonprofit incubator and accelerator partners and pulled that forward so they could work directly with the small businesses like Orlando's to help them through the economic gap that COVID created. And then second, we are doubling down on our diversity, equity, and inclusion engagement as we go forward. And in fact, are going to release a funding cycle that, again, will work with those nonprofit partners that are out in the community to develop programs targeted way upstream to bring in new entrepreneurs well in advance of our program. So this may not even benefit us directly. In fact, I suspect it may not, because these are entrepreneurs that are not even at a place where they would qualify for our program, but rather we want to identify those diverse entrepreneurs very early on and put the support around them from their local incubator and clean tech ecosystem, such that they can actually grow a business and engage in this space as they go forward. So really excited about what that's going to mean for us next year.
That's fantastic. And kudos to the Chamber for bringing on incredible organizations like we have here, and entrepreneurs that represent solutions to these big, hairy problems beyond just necessarily, incubation or acceleration for purely financial returns, but so much more, which is awesome. I know we're getting close on time, but I did have one last question. And so this kind of brings us a little bit back to where we were mid-session, but Orlando, as you talked about, or I guess it was Hijay, that talked a little bit more about finding a shared vision and making sure that was aligned before you joined. The question was, when it comes to community buy-in, and you think about finding champions, and you think about finding people in the organization that are just crazy enough to make that career risk to partner with an early stage company, how do you thoughts on gaining the trust in your vision? So on enabling that person to trust you in your vision for the future and for the company.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking that, Scott. I mean, I think if your vision is clear in your mind, if your vision is clear, externally communicated, if your vision is compelling and relevant to what's going on in kind of the problems that we have, all kinds of issues out there, I think That's the start. And then, of course, you do need to find champions within these companies, or your investors or your philanthropic contributors, to be able to share that vision and actually grow together, because it's a learning journey for, I think, all parties involved. So it's really very much your shared vision that you're cultivating in line with all the stakeholders as well.
That's fantastic. Can't think of a better way to close than clarity and vision. Very hard to do, and it seems to evolve over time. But gosh, it's valuable. Great. Well, we're out of time, so I do have to kick it back to Alexa and the team. But Hijay, Orlando, Anne, and Ramsey, thank you for joining me and the Chamber, and thank you to the Chamber for allowing me to host this discussion. It's been really valuable for me and hopefully for those listening.